In today's satsang, I think we'll cover the small topic of God. We'll talk about God, source, consciousness, awareness, the absolute, the creator, the purpose of life. So, before I get into it, I'll throw out some of the concepts that I often mention. One is that the talks, although we might talk about God and source and consciousness, they really all are about one topic, and that is happiness for the human being in daily living. And so whatever is mentioned because it is relevant to that topic of happiness, which turns out to be peace of mind. So when I say happiness, we might think, oh, I'm not so interested in this. Roger is talking about feeling positive and excited and laughing and feelings of happiness because of circumstance. And a lot of seekers have gone past the notion that what we are looking for in life is happiness in the form of circumstance and feeling good because of outcomes, which is, the traditional idea of happiness. So on the one hand, I could say, I'm not talking about happiness. What I'm talking about is peace of mind. And peace of mind is the end of suffering. If we can get our head around that we are talking about happiness because really we're all just seeking happiness. But it's important to realize that happiness is available on a continuous, unbroken basis in this life in a very particular form. And that is not happiness through pleasure, not happiness which is a form of pleasure, but rather happiness in the form of unbroken peace of mind. And when we ask what is peace of mind, because we might imagine peace of mind as a feeling of bliss, stoutness, or a feeling of peace. But more accurately described, peace of mind is the absence of something, the non-arising, the non-existence of something. So it's the non-existence, the non-arising, the absence of suffering. And what is suffering? Suffering in its most practical manifestation is an uncomfortableness with oneself. All the various forms of suffering, guilt, blame, pride, worry, expectation, when we really feel into them, they're an uncomfortableness. They manifest as an uncomfortableness. So inherently those movements, psychological movements that we call suffering, have an uncomfortableness of self in them. So it's important to also note that the word suffering is not referring to the suffering of physical pain. That would be the use of the word suffering in a different context with a different definition. So suffering as it's being used here means a very particular movement, which is being defined as psychological uncomfortableness, which means the inherent uncomfortableness of the psychological me that seems to develop quite naturally as part of the human growth process. So suffering is referring to an uncomfortableness of self, an uncomfortableness of the psychological component, the psychological identity, the idea of who we are, the deeply ingrained idea that doesn't appear to be an idea when it's felt. It appears to be something concrete. because the beliefs are so deeply ingrained and so related to and created by the brain as absolutely who I am, that when circumstance, which is very much intertwined into our idea of who we are, turns out in a way that is taken to be an attack on this psychological idea of ourself, then the feeling that arises is a feeling that I have been attacked by that circumstance, that action of the other, the non-deliverance of something that the other said they were going to deliver. So the circumstance where things have turned out a particular way is experienced as an attack on who I am that feels like something very concrete. Whereas in fact, when we dive into it and start picking it apart, when life starts unraveling, allowing awareness to see into the structure, it becomes clear that the psychological me is not a concrete entity that exists in some true fashion, exists as something real, but is rather a construct of ideas that fundamentally the ideas are capable of changing in any moment, which means the structure of this psychological me is dictated by the ideas as they exist in that moment. So as soon as an idea changes, the psychological me changes. Usually those ideas don't change radically. They change, in principle, they remain the same, and we may sort of just change what we're attached to, which is part of the psychological me. We might shift from being attached to the sandpit to being attached to a new car to being attached to a promotion at work. And so as we get older, we might feel defined by different outcomes. So in principle, we're still defined by an outcome, but the details of what it is that we feel defined by can change, as in the particular outcomes can change, but the principle remains the same. If, however, that principle is seen through, and there's a realization that I am not defined by outcomes, meaning outcomes don't make me who I am. So that's what the deeply ingrained belief that I am defined by outcomes basically says. When I get this, this, and this, when I get this, this, and this, I can prove to myself that I am whole, worthy, complete. We have an idea that when I get this, this, and this, and I can present myself to the world as whole, worthy, and complete, then I'll feel like I can relax. And these are all assumptions. They're all concepts that are not seen as concepts. They're seen to be, this is how it is, which in my language is a belief. So a concept that is no longer seen as a concept that may actually be wrong. So a concept that says, when I have proved my worth as a human being to myself by achieving this, this, and this, and I can then present that resume to the rest of the world, then I'll be able to relax and feel like I have a place, that life is worthwhile, that my purpose has been achieved. That's a concept. That's a notion that may be right, it may be wrong. I would suggest, the teaching suggests that concept is a little misguided, that isn't where our sense of fulfillment, our sense of at easeness with ourself, with life, with dying, with life coming to an end, that's not where it comes from. And yet, for a large part of our life, as I'm suggesting, someone might say, if I achieve enough things, then when I'm old and death is not far away, I can look at my list of achievements and say, oh, look, this is what I'm leaving behind. It's okay for me to now die because I have lived a worthwhile life, and this is what I have to show for it. We can understand, when you think about it, it's such an appealing notion. It seems to make sense to a thinking mind that assumes that one's sense of self is determined by outcomes. So then, with that presupposition, with that assumption that is truth, it makes sense that I need outcomes, I need success, I need life to turn out a particular way, or better, but at least the way I have set up as a benchmark, which is a whole lot of outcomes. And therefore we are forced to move our energy and our focus in that direction, which is into the future, outcomes that don't exist yet. And so we become identified and attached psychologically. So it means our identity is interwoven with this idea of what is to come in the future, and there's no freedom in that. There's no freedom in that because that means that the psychological me, the psychological identity, the idea-based entity that doesn't feel like an idea-based identity until it starts to be revealed as that, is very much in place. And that idea-based, what I mean by idea is concept that is taken to be a belief, which then feels very real and very concrete. That psychological me obstructs, because it sort of fills the space of the present moment. It obstructs what we could call a deeper sense of self, a more true identity, or let's leave the word identity out, a more true essence, true self. Self, in this case, with a capital S. And why would I create the distinction of self with a capital S? And the reason being is that, go back 5 or 10 minutes, and I said that suffering is ultimately an uncomfortableness with oneself, an uncomfortableness of self, meaning not an uncomfortableness of the body, not an uncomfortableness of, an uncomfortable chair, but an uncomfortableness on a level of who I know myself as. Now, the only self that is capable of feeling uncomfortable on an intrinsic level is the self with a small s, which is the psychological me, the idea-based entity or identity, the concept-based self. Now, so the concept-based, this is who I am idea, this is what I need idea, that don't appear as ideas because they're deeply ingrained, so they just arise as a desire, for example, or a sense of being the best or the worst. That's the psychological me in action, and it doesn't feel like an idea. As I said, only once we start unpicking it do we see that it's really conceptually based, i.e. thought-based. That is the identity that can suffer. That is the identity that can feel uncomfortable. That is the identity that feels incomplete. That is the identity that feels unworthy because it has been told either directly or by people's actions that what it is doing is not good enough, that you are wrong, you are not adequate the way you are. And that is also, it doesn't require someone else to tell you that. If you set up an idea that what I want is to be successful in this, and then through the functioning of the body there is no success because you thought that this would be a great business idea, you invested money in it, and it didn't turn out to be right, then we will say to ourselves, oh, you are not good enough, because of our attachment to the outcome. The notion that says, my sense of completeness will be when I deliver this outcome. I am the one that is in control of delivering the outcome. If I do it right, if I choose the right things, if I make the right decisions, then I'll get a good result, and then I will have contributed to my completeness. And because life unfolds sort of differently to our concept of how it unfolds, sometimes, often, the outcomes are not as we imagine. And so we don't need someone else to tell us we're not good enough. We will tell ourselves, oh, you didn't succeed. You're not that good. The true essence, which is a self, or the core of the human being, the core self, that is very different in nature to the psychological me, isn't capable of suffering. Why is it not capable of suffering? Because when we look at what suffering is an output of the thinking mind. It is an output of the psychological me. It is always an attitude to how life unfolds, an attitude to the actions that are taking place through the human being. And that attitude is usually an attitude of judgment, an attitude of worry and guilt and blame. And more fundamentally, that psychological me is simply incapable of being whole. The only capacity of wholeness is prior to thinking. The capacity to know wholeness is a capacity to see the present moment without creating a judgment or a separation between what is and what should be. And if that movement of essentially finding fault with how life turns out in this moment, in many different ways, in finding fault with what the other does, finding fault with what we do, finding fault with how nature unfolds. If that finding fault notion falls away, that finding fault thinking falls away, what reveals itself is the fact that there is a harmony, there is there is what is, which includes the great diversity of daily living. So daily living is described in this teaching as, on the level of practical daily life, a duality, meaning interconnected opposites. And interconnected opposites allow for the great diversity to exist. If there were no interconnected opposites, if there was no duality on any level, then there would be no definition to life. There would be no, life would be completely monotone. Monotone basically means of one type. So non-duality implies everything is the same. And the notion of non-duality is pointing at the subatomic level, let's say, or the fundamental qualities of everything. However, on another layer, the fundamental oneness presents as two-ness. So hence we can say that circumstantially life is duality, a whole range of interconnected opposites. So you can see in the description of duality, we're not making it an absolute duality because it's interconnected opposites, which really means that, let's say, take hot and cold. They're interconnected opposites, which means that the hot and the cold are different ends of a spectrum. So the spectrum is in itself non-dual, however, has these polar opposites within the spectrum. And it's the duality that allows the diversity of life to be there. So a change in attitude, a change of attitude to what is happening, is essentially what brings about the falling away of the psychological me. The psychological me is, it's essentially a thought form. And so when the psychological me is active, we call that the thinking mind. And the thinking mind is always judging what is, but looking at it and saying, this is what it should be. And the falling away of that psychological identity means a change in the attitude to what is, from looking at what is and saying, oh, it's this, but it should be that, to simply looking at it as what is. And remember, the true identity was defined as being something that is not a psychological entity. It's not a psychological me. It's different in quality. It's different in nature to the psychological me that seems to get in place, to put in place. The psychological me being this deeply ingrained belief of what I need, where my happiness is going to come from, who I am. Essentially, it's an idea of ourself that largely is heavily identified with the physical entity, identified with the intellectual and the emotional. So those are the gross aspects of the human being that, as we're growing up, stand out. As we're growing up, from a baby, an infant, a small child, an adolescent, adult, the gross aspects, the body, the outcomes, the thinking, the feelings that we have, the emotions that we have, tend to be more obvious in the experience of life. And so the idea-based me tends to develop around the more obvious aspects of our experience. And the less obvious aspect of our experience is what we could say we could say that's the most important aspect of the human being that tends to get overlooked, and therefore our sense of self is disconnected from that. Our idea of ourself completely leaves out any appreciation of what could be argued to be the most important part of the human being. Now, going back to the fact that the psychological self is thought-based, and the true nature, the true essence that gets overlooked, is not thought-based. So what would a word be that we could use for this true nature? And the words are there so that hopefully the working mind hears these words. And because if I just keep talking about our true nature, for example, and then say, off you go and find it. It could be like, well, I didn't get many hints. So we can start putting words onto this. Not that the word is what it is, but the word can be like a label that gives us a sense of how to start off by cognizing, thinking about what is said, and yet the teachings say you'll never know yourself by thinking, because this essence that is being pointed to is not a thought form. So consciousness or awareness are words that are sometimes used, or the absolute are words that are used to direct attention into towards, or rather to direct attention away from what we are not. So the concept, you'll never know yourself through thought. You won't be able to think the answer. That concept, which is a concept as delivered in a teaching, really means a pointer, it's a hint. It's a very important hint. Why is it important? It's important because, remember, the psychological me is a thought-based identity, and so it is habituated to thinking about life. It believes that it is true, which means it believes that thought is truth. And so when it thinks about answers, it relates to the process of thinking as being a truth-based modality. So it's habituated the human being, and more particularly the psychological me, is habituated to try and find answers through thought. And so really at a certain point of our spiritual seeking, the teachings, the pointers try to drive home that thinking is the problem. We have created, life has created a prison, a conceptual prison. And that freedom exists outside of that conceptual prison. Freedom exists outside of the very, very, very limited notions of thought. And why they're limited is because, imagine if, or think about the fact that if you have an error somewhere in your thinking, a presupposition that is an error. And so presupposition is something you suppose to be true as a default. And let's say that's an error or very limiting. then that means that everything else that is formed on top of that thinking assumption is going to be limited by that presupposition about how things are. A bit like putting a wrong number into a formula. That from then on, every number you get out of the formula, if the formula included a wrong calculation early on, all of the numbers that you work off are going to be off. So you might ask a question like, if God created everything, who created God? And it seems like a very valid question. Now, it's a valid question based on our assessment, which is based on our experience, which is based on our senses and our intellectual capacity of processing and concluding what life is. It's based on the assumption that life unfolds and is created based on how it appears. So we have the presupposition that things happen according to causality within a reality of time. That A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D. And so there is an assumption that, okay, God created man, so the cause of man is God. So the effect, the cause is God and the effect is man. So on that basis, and that principle then is mirrored down on every aspect of life. We look at life and it appears to have at its base a fundamental rule of causality. So then the question, well, if God created everything, who created God, or what created God? What is the cause of God? It seems like a valid question. But what if causality isn't the fundamental truth of creation, and yet it is assumed to be a fundamental truth of creation? Then we try working out an answer to a question that seems to be a valid question on the surface, because we've said the presupposition is that causality is the fundamental mechanism by which things come into existence. And so if that's presupposed to be true, we end up with a question that seems to have a problematic nature to it. Whereas if our thinking realizes, what if the presupposition that causality is the nature of how things come about, what if that is not true? Then the question that assumes causality to be how things happen may be a completely invalid question. If we knew life to happen differently to causality, then the question of where God came from may not even be, it might be a non-starter. We might actually say, well, that's an odd question to ask, because that's not how life happens. So that was going to be an example for a concept I was putting forward, and I can't remember what the concept was. So we might have a tangent in what we were speaking about. I think it had something to do with the obsession of the psychological me to think about answers, to think that it will find the truth in an answer, because it has mistaken itself, which is a thought-based entity, to be true, to be real. It hasn't realized its nature. And once it realizes the nature of thought, which is something that is very transitory, very changeable, that we change our minds in an instant, and that we can change our minds radically in an instant when some new information comes in. So the example I was just giving that says, this idea of who created or what created God, what is the cause of God, it could be a question that has troubled someone for 10, 20, 30 years. And then information comes in and says, what if causality isn't the explanation for reality? Then you can drop that question. And that might actually undermine a question that has existed and has troubled someone for 10, 20, 30 years. And they say, all of a sudden the question just doesn't make sense anymore. The question, I see that the question may be invalid, may be flawed. And so when we really see that the question is based on a presupposition that may not be the truth, because it's based on our assessment of how life works, which is quite possibly very limited. If we really click, wow, it may not be a valid question, then we won't hold on to it in the way that we had held on to it when we believed it to be a true question based on a presupposition that wasn't seen to be a presupposition that may not be correct. So do we know ourselves? And the suggestion is that if we're obsessed with thinking, which is a very common, normal, default human development trait, we don't. So teachings emphasize thinking is the problem. Now, we can refine these concepts. So many of you have heard me say thinking per se is not the problem, but rather it's the thinking mind and the suffering that stems from the psychological me, the psychological identity, that is the problem. The working mind that needs to work out the functional requirements of daily living problems is not a problematic form of thinking. And in fact, if we wished that our thinking was taken away in totality, if that was delivered, we would find we couldn't function, because a very important aspect of our functioning is the working mind, which is distinct from the psychological me, the thinking mind. But nonetheless, that distinction may not be helpful when covering certain topics, when trying to illuminate certain aspects. And so a teaching will just say, and rightly so, I'm going to say it today, thinking is the problem. Why? Because we need to hammer home that if a seeker inadvertently keeps trying to think about what is, tries to think about non-duality, and tries to work it out in the head, that's not going to happen. The true self is not a thought-based is not thought-based in nature. And remember, the psychological me, the thought-based movement, obscures the more subtle. So this is where we go back to the word that was used. And let's stick to one of them, awareness. What we truly are is awareness. And awareness is prior to the body. Awareness is prior to thought. Awareness is prior to emotion. Awareness is fundamental. We could say awareness is absolute. And that everything else in life is relative or changing. The true is unchanging. The truth is unchanging. The real is unchanging. The psychological me is thought-based, and thoughts are one of the most changeable objects, one of the most relative objects that exists in the manifestation. You know, our thinking easily mistakes the fact that we like something, we see something as right, take a political party, simply because it is delivering something that I value or I appreciate or that gives me pleasure. And our thinking can overlook the fact that I am pro party X because they are giving me something I like. And that thinking can miss the fact that I am very different to Joe or Jane, and Joe or Jane have different life circumstance, and party X may not deliver to Joe or Jane what party X delivers to Roger. And if our thinking doesn't appreciate that Joe or Jane have different priorities and party Y delivers their priorities big time, party X doesn't. And Roger, being different, has different preferences, different priorities, different pleasures. And party X delivers his big time and party Y doesn't. And so if our thinking doesn't appreciate this, our thinking says, well, I have assessed party X to be the best, so party X is the best. Now, you are telling me party Y is the best, and that just doesn't compute. You're wrong. And we can get into big fights, we can lose friends or whatever over the fact that someone thinks differently or wants values, different values, simply because our thinking hasn't understood the workings properly. Now, if this is explained and the working mind hears it and go, oh wow, I've never thought about that. That, people are pro party X, not because party X is morally the best necessarily, but rather because party X delivers their preferences, their pleasures, and their pleasures, that party X delivers are rated higher than morality, for example, for that person. It makes complete sense. So if a dynamic is seen, then in an instant, our insistence that party X or party Y is the best can change. Now, all of that was just an example to try and show how changeable our thinking is. That as soon as new information comes in, and our assessment, our thinking assesses something differently, our position can change radically in an instant. So thinking is changeable. And the non-dual teachings, the awareness teachings, which have so much value, are trying to shift attention, shift identification from identification with that which is unreal, that which is changing, onto an aspect of daily life that is truth or real or unchanging. Why is all this effort being made to create a shift? Okay, it's back. So why is all this effort being made to bring about this shift in identification? It's because we've become identified as part of the growing up process, the human evolution within a human's life, the evolution from day 1 to day 2 to week 3, week 5, month 2, month 8, year 1, year 2, has been an evolution where an identification with the unreal has happened, but in such a way that the unreal is taken to be real. An identification with the changing in such a way that the changing isn't seen to be changing. And if the changing is assumed to be real, when in fact it is not real, the real is obscured. Our attention is on the decoy, and the decoy is there saying, hey, look at me, I am what's important. And so if we're looking at the decoy, thinking that that is what is important, what is really important may go unnoticed. So the teachings are saying, what you are is not what you have imagined yourself to be. What you are is the formless awareness in which all of life arises. What you are is not the body. The body is also changing. The body is, like everything else in life, changing on a microsecond by microsecond basis, and it also changes on a more macro basis. Your hair goes from being dark brown to grey, or from being plentiful to falling out. The body goes from being firm and tight to less firm and tight and more wrinkly. A table goes from being brand new and eventually it turns into dust. So there's very obvious change on a macro level, and we tend not to notice the change on a micro level. So if we were to see a time lapse of 100 years and you were to see the table 100 years in 20 seconds, you might well see the table go from solid to a very different form. But we miss the changeability of the table moment to moment to moment. And if our attention starts to reassess the table and the chair and the person and the thinking, so our thoughts tend to change over time. We have less situations where our thinking changes radically in a particular moment, unless we're being exposed to conditioning that tends to highlight our thinking process. And even though we can have these big shifts in thinking, they tend to fall between the cracks, because relative to the thought form that remains fairly constant, they are few and far between. So our appreciation of the changeability of thought, the changeability of emotions, is lost, is missed. Whereas when we start looking, we see, wow, the table is changing on a microscopic level. It's like a soup of atoms, and we might not see it on the surface. But if we can come to understand in principle that that's the case, and we might even start to, I'm not sure that I mean seeing with the eyes, but a combination of your intellectual working mind appreciation of the fact that the table changes on a micro level may allow you to see the table differently. Then we add into the mix that the table and the other person and the world of form is not necessarily so. That form and time and space are all appearances in the present moment. That they appear to be, but what appears to be is not necessarily so. Especially if what appears to be is changing. So all of what we have taken to be real, when we start to look at it in more detail using the litmus test of what is real is unchanging, what changes is not real. When we use that litmus test, we start to realize that so much of what we have taken to be the truth is in fact variable. So, someone might say, why is the true unchanging and why is the changing not true? Well, it's not an absolute proof, but just something that might shed some more light onto this is that if someone is telling the truth in a in a court situation, for example, if they're telling the truth, no matter how much you investigate it, no matter from which angle it's looked at, it will hold up. If someone is not telling the truth, then upon enough investigation, it will fail to hold up as truth. So the truth is unchanging. The untrue doesn't have that same nature, that same quality. And our assessment of what is real has tended to be based on certain presuppositions, like if it feels true, if it feels real, if it appears real, then it must be real. And so that's a conclusion that needs to be seen to be flawed in nature, because if it's not, what happens is that whenever anything appears to be real, the assessment is it appears to be real, so it must be real. Take various ideas that you have about something. Take memory. It appears to be accurate. And it's only in hindsight that we find out, what appeared to be accurate wasn't accurate. Not all the time, but we have examples of when that's the case. We can be sure that we knocked on the blue door, and then we find out that it wasn't the blue door, it was the one next to the blue door. You can look at anxiety, for example, as a feeling, or any other number of feelings, especially suffering feelings, where something feels very true. It feels like it is the most important thing. It feels like what we believe has happened, what we think is going to happen, is the truth. If anyone's ever suffered from hypochondria, you get this feeling because of a symptom or something that's there, and you're convinced that this is what you are suffering from, what illness you have. And there might be 2 or 3 symptoms matched with a Google search, and there's this conviction, this is what I have. And it feels real. And then you wake up in the morning and a different perspective might exist. You might go to the doctor and the doctor says, that's this. And something completely harmless, easily treated. And it becomes apparent how misguided, misleading that feeling that felt so true was. One thing that showed me this at a young age was at school, sitting for tests or exams. I'd come out of a test or exam and I thought, I've done so badly in that exam, like really terribly. And then I get the results back and I'd done quite well. But I wasn't a great student. I was middle of the road. And similarly, I'd have a thought that says, I've done fantastically in that test. Like, I can't see any of the answers I've got wrong. And sometimes I've barely passed when I get the results back. So at a young age, I started to realize, do not trust your feelings. Which, is ironic because sometimes we're told, trust your feelings. And there's a place for both concepts. They shouldn't be seen as opposites or contradictions. We're talking about different different subjects in a way. When someone says, well, follow your feeling, that doesn't mean that your feeling is true. But if you're going to choose a way to live life, why not follow your feeling? Unless you realize that every time you follow your feeling, you find out that your feeling was misleading. Then actually I would say, when you feel like going to the left, go to the right. But if until that becomes evident that what you're feeling is consistently wrong, then at some point do what you feel like, which maybe is like what you really feel like doing without any shoulds or shouldn'ts getting in the way. So we might see, what you feel like is, in that context, is talking about what you feel like versus a conditioned set of how you should live life. So they're two different subjects here. Do what you feel like compared to what you should and shouldn't, versus seeing the fact that what appears to be true can be misleading. And if we fall into the trap of saying this feels true, therefore it's true, the illusion of life, which is very intertwined with the psychological me that has established itself, that has been established. So the psychological me gets established, and as a result of that psychological me, we are going to feel like we need a lot of things. We're going to feel like someone being polite to me or being honest to me is extremely important. And at some point we need to start questioning whether what feels important is as important as it feels. Is it as true as it feels? And as far as suffering goes, I would go as far as to say suffering is based on the false identity. It is absolutely the wrong identity. It's the identity that covers up our true nature. And therefore, any form of suffering, if you're going to take a default, I would take the default that the suffering tells me that I have to hate the other because they have done something that has attacked me. I have to hate myself. I have to worry about the future. I have to have expectations because that's where my happiness is to be found. And when the suffering is arising, it feels like that is the truth of the matter. And I would say if you've identified suffering as suffering, if you've become familiar with what suffering is, one of the most freeing realizations is this realization that what feels true is not always the case. So with suffering, I would say almost as a blanket rule, it is never telling us the truth, especially the truth about who we are. And so that allows the feeling to be there because some of these feelings arise based on very well-established patterns, very well-established, even, ingrained structures. So they're not necessarily going to stop arising, but the understanding that that is the functioning of the false self and that what I am is prior to that. Can create a distance, and the thought that arises, this is not the truth, can be an important wedge that creates a gap between the feeling of suffering, in which the sense of self is heavily identified and involved in and lost in where there is no space, and the thought that says this is not true. can create a shift to that part of the human being that is unchanging. And what is unchanging? What is unchanging is the awareness that is aware of all that is changing. You are not the body. This is an important concept in this exploration that we're talking about here. The body too is a changing object that is very different in nature to that which is aware of everything, including the body. That which is aware of the body, the thoughts, the emotions, and what appears to be the external world. So the tables and the chairs and the cars are known from the perspective of the body to be external. The thinking, the feelings and the emotions, we could say, are internal to the body. If we start to know ourselves as that which is unchanging, all that we know as internal and external relative to the body are seen as internal relative to this unchanging self. The awareness that is the background, the foundation, the crucible, the canister in which the experience of life arises. And the body is just another object amongst all the other objects in which life arises. This awareness is in nature formless, empty, and its nature is awareness. There is not something that is aware. It is not a human that is aware or a body that has awareness, but rather there is just awareness. Awareness happening. And that awareness is primary. It requires no thinking of what is happening in order to know, not know of the intellect, but to know the tree, to know the movement of the present moment, to be aware of what is arising within it. The awareness is the awareness of Source. Source in its unmanifest form is absolute nothing. And Source or awareness at rest in its absolute nothing form, we could say is pure potentiality. Potentiality means not something, but potentially something. So if the world as we know it is not the unmanifest, but rather the manifest. So if you look at, if there is awareness of the world, of time and space and form, which includes the body, and there is awareness of the fact that there is awareness of this manifestation. If you imagine the manifestation shrinking, the manifestation is essentially the expansion, the actualization of the potential. So the potential has turned into the actualized. The unmanifest has turned into the manifest. So the experience of life is the manifest. It is the potential actualized. So the Big Bang is a metaphor for what was in a potential form as pure potentiality but not actualized, the moment of explosion was the moment of the potential turning into the manifest. Now, if we reverse that and shrink it down into the smallest of dots, a bit like I used to like imagining an old television screen, one of the tube television screens, with the picture on it is the everything. And then when you turn off the power, the picture would shrink down to a circle, and the circle would get smaller and smaller and smaller till it was a little white dot in the middle of the screen, in the middle of the tube, the television tube, and then even that white dot would disappear. Now, with that image, you might still have the image of the physical television there, so try and block that out. And all you're looking at is the visual, the picture, that is the manifest. And then when you turn the power off, the picture collapses down to a little dot, and then even the dot disappears. And that is us imagining the manifest returning to the unmanifest, ready to express in the next moment even as everything again. So you could, if you turned on the TV set, bang, the tube lights up again, the image is there, and then you turn it off and the image collapses down to nothing. And so reality is sometimes described as source spontaneously manifesting and collapsing back into nothing, remanifesting, collapsing back into nothing, manifesting, collapsing back into nothing. And each moment is independent of the next. However, as it appears, is like one continuous reality. Because what is not seen are the gaps in between the manifest. Because the nature of the unmanifest is to not be aware of itself. And the unmanifest, in its absolute nature, is not even aware of itself, and in its manifest form, awareness of itself through awareness of the manifestation comes into existence. So life is not as it appears. It appears to be a life of form, a life of an objective reality, a time-based reality. And we are being pointed at that is the illusion, that the whole of the universe, which in practical terms means that which is arising in your present, in the present moment experience that there is awareness of. So the notion of the universe as one very big time-bound existence, as we have conceptualized the universe, is another idea that needs to be challenged. For as long as you hear me say the universe and imagine this very vast space-bound reality, there will always be the notion of an out there. And awareness is not some theoretical awareness in which the vastness of the universe that we have conceptualized to exists in, but rather awareness is that in which the universe that is this present moment arises. And the present moment, if we want to be really present if there is going to be presence with the present moment, in appreciating the present moment, there can be an appreciation that the present moment is not that vast, especially if the present moment is of a 4 meter by 4 meter room. And yet that 4 meter by 4 meter room fits into the container of pure awareness. And yet, if the 4 meter by 4 meter room is replaced by a view from a mountaintop where hundreds of kilometers, what appears like hundreds of kilometers exist, that too is an appearance within a field of consciousness, the same field of awareness. And a night dream that may include an ocean with billions of liters of water is not as real, as form-based as it might appear. It too is an ocean that arises within a field of awareness. And so that field of awareness can contain hundreds of people, or one person, or in fact, in a meditation experience, we might, if there is a presence with the present moment, the present moment can go from being a 4 by 4 meter room, it can be an ocean or a mountaintop view, to being the absence of objects that we typically associate with daily living. Now, I don't jump to the fact that that is nothing, because a meditation experience is an experience of the present moment, where the present moment is not filled with typical daily living objects. But what there is in a meditation experience is awareness of the present moment, which is different in content to every other. Well, every present moment is different in content to every other present moment that we might remember. And so if we put remembering aside, all there is the present moment that we can relate to as always changing, continually in flux. And yet that which is aware of that which is continually in flux remains unchanging, and in nature is not part of the content, but that which the content arises in, that which the content is ultimately made of, and that which witnesses the ever-changing content that it is not separate from. That awareness is said to be the awareness of Source. And everything that arises in awareness is made of awareness. The best analogy to allow our working mind to comprehend how a table that for our whole life has been experienced as an objectively real object independent of my awareness, the best analogy to allow us to reassess the nature of the table is to think of a night dream in which it's very clear that any objects that arise in the night dream are interdependent on the consciousness in which they rise. And our typical way of interpreting a night dream is that it happens in the mind of the human being. So if we look at it that way, the night dream happens within the consciousness or mind of the human being, and therefore the table and the chair and the people in the dream are made of mind stuff. Now, a night dream from this perspective is arising in the very same awareness of Source in which the daily life experience is arising. So in top-down spiritual teachings, in non-duality spiritual teachings, they will talk about the three states. the waking state, the dream state, and deep sleep state. And the suggestion is that there is no difference between the waking state and the dream state. They are exactly the same in nature, content arising in the same awareness. And it's just that in the waking state, the content is arranged in a way where there is a certain consistency, including memory with a consistency that creates a sense of linearity. And so we can say that the manifestation in the waking state, which is really content arising in awareness, is created to create the impression or the illusion of life being an objective reality. And then the night dream appears to be a separate manifestation inside the mind of the human being. So the waking state doesn't appear to be an appearance in consciousness at first. The waking state seems to be the appreciation of an objective world and a human being. Then at the dream state appears to be imagination created in the mind of the human being by the human mind. And the teachings are saying there is no difference between the waking state and the dream state. They are both appearances, in principle exactly the same, content arising in the same mind of Source, of God. All there is consciousness. All there is God. Everything is God. Everything is consciousness. That means that the table in the waking state is made of consciousness. It's an appearance in consciousness. The tree, the sky, the body, the thoughts, the emotions, everything in the waking state is an appearance in consciousness, an appearance in Brahman, in God. All there is God. The nature of life is God. Nothing is separate from God. Nothing can exist outside of God. That means in the waking state, whatever exists, whatever is known, is only known because it arises in awareness. It is an object arising in God, which means you can say God has imagined it into existence. Just like if we use the night dream in a different context to the three states here, we say the night dream was imagined into existence by the human being. But the non-dual teaching say no, the dream state is also happening in the mind of God. It just creates, there is just the impression that it is happening within the mind of the human. Now the deep sleep state, which is the third state, is the same except with no content. And yet, in this explanation, a fourth state, turiya, as it's known in Sanskrit, the fourth state is the awareness of the three states. So it's sort of like an umbrella awareness that says what seem like three states can be known as maybe three aspects within a broader awareness. And so this is where the notion of there is awareness, there has to be awareness as the background to all of the three states, the waking state, the dream state, and the deep sleep state. Awareness is the background of the three states. And being aware of awareness as the background of the three states is the fourth state. So the liberated attitude, the liberated perspective, is a perspective of knowing oneself as essentially the background that is the awareness, aware of everything that arises in it. And so deep sleep is the absence of content, but the presence of awareness. The dream state is the presence of content, and there is awareness of the content. And the waking state is the same as the dream state, where there is the presence of content and the awareness of that content. So, Wei Wu Wei would refer to the waking state as the presence of presence, and the deep sleep state as the presence of absence. So in both cases, there is the presence, which is the awareness of presence represents content. So presence of presence means the presence of the waking state, the presence of daily living. The dream state is the same, presence of presence, the presence of the content of the dream. And the deep sleep, in this particular conceptual explanation, would be the presence of absence. Or the presence of the absence of presence, meaning the awareness that there is no waking state. But the fact that there is awareness of no waking state basically means that the identity has shifted from knowing oneself as the content to being the formless awareness that is aware of all of the content. And even in deep sleep, where there is no content in the typical sense, as there is in the waking state, so no tables and chairs and no sky and sun and ocean and body, in deep sleep, there is still awareness of nothing. And all of that is the manifest. The unmanifest, according to Wei Wu Wei's concept to describe what really can't fully be described because it is beyond thought. Nonetheless, there is a concept for it, and there is the waking state is the presence of presence. The deep sleep state is the presence of the absence of presence. So there is awareness that there is no form. So the presence, the awareness of the absence of content means the presence of the absence of presence. And the unmanifest, here's the brain twister, is the absence of the presence of presence and the absence of the presence of absence of presence, which is the complete absence of even the knowing of no daily living, which is described as deep sleep. So in that concept, deep sleep is the awareness of nothing, the awareness of no waking state. So that means no sense of being a body or a human being, just formless awareness, aware of nothing. And the unmanifest is the absence of even that, which means the absence of awareness of nothing. So that equates to the concept that exists here and there, much less than most other concepts, which it says that in its most natural state, Source is not even aware of itself. Now, to try and imagine the absence of the presence of presence and the absence of the presence of absence, the absence of the presence of presence and the absence of the presence of absence of presence, to try and imagine that is not that, because as soon as we imagine it, that is thought in manifestation, which is both the presence of presence, there is awareness of thought, and what we're talking about, the absence of everything, cannot possibly be known. How it can be comprehended to some extent is by becoming very familiar with the states of the manifestation. And at some point, our brain, knowing the presence of presence, knowing the presence of the absence of presence, which are all states in the manifestation that we can become familiar with, and they're states where the self is known in a very basic, undefined form, where the physical entity is not there, the gender is not there, preferences is not there, thinking is not there, and there's just simple awareness. It might dawn on us that the unmanifest is the absence of even the most basic awareness that we are familiar with when we're familiar with it. And it's like the brain does a sort of it knows it by essentially knowing the most basic, and then it's not really an imagination. Who knows? Anyway, we can only go so far in describing all of this. We might lose track of the fact that what we're really looking for is not to know the truth, not to know the absence of presence and the absence of presence, but rather all of these things that have been spoken about in today's talk can contribute to an appreciation of life from a different perspective, can contribute to the dismantling, the eroding away of the psychological me that is based on seeing life a very particular way, the way that it appears on the surface as uninvestigated human development reveals it. And so all of these concepts that are pointing us primarily today to a place where we might come to know ourselves as that which essentially is here right now and is the background of every single momentary experience, and that knowing itself might happen when the thinking mind stops trying to figure stuff out, and there is an awareness of the changing, it's changing, and an allowing all of the form to be there, appreciating that that form may not be as form-like as it appears, that it may be an appearance within consciousness, just like a dream at night feels real but can be known to be an appearance within mind. And maybe in allowing, in sitting with life, more and more regularly, there can be an appreciation that life may well be like a dream arising in the mind of God. And that the struggle, the objectives that have been set in place as what life is all about may be based on our misinterpretation, may be based on a limited assessment of what's going on, all of which is part and parcel of the dream arising in consciousness, created by consciousness. So there is no one doing it right or wrong. There is no one misinterpreting life, but rather there is, in each moment, the interpretation of life as determined by the Creator, as determined by the manifestation as it's presenting in this moment. All are happening according to God's will. This shift in perspective might be useful because it can reveal experientially that there really is no doer in the way that we have come to know ourselves as a separate entity in control of everything that happens, but rather that there is life happening. And that new perspective can contribute to the dissolving of the psychological me. That means less suffering and more peace of mind. Peace of mind ultimately within the dream of consciousness. A realization or a recognition that life is an appearance within consciousness doesn't suddenly mean that the appearance in consciousness ceases. It doesn't suddenly mean that we get special powers or that we are no longer forced to live as a human being. However, it means that the human being has a capacity to drop into a state of being where the knowing of oneself is not limited to the physical, but the knowing of oneself extends deeper to the point where we can wonder whether we are a body with consciousness or whether we are a consciousness in which a body arises, whether we are both or neither. And having been lived to the point where that movement, that resting in being happens more consistently, at some point, all of that becomes inconsequential, and the assumption, the assessment is, well, whatever it is, I have to live my life as a human being, and as long as suffering no longer arises in the way that it used to, when identification with the body was the sole knowing of oneself, and the purpose of life was heavily linked to outcomes and the future and what happened in the past, when that tends to fall away, the direct feedback is, actually it doesn't really matter what exactly the truth is, because I get to live my life as this human being, free of suffering. And what is important about a life free of suffering is that the questions about what is the purpose of life don't arise, simply because the uncomfortableness isn't there. And when the uncomfortableness isn't there, we find that the question is a non-starter. And when the uncomfortableness is there, essentially there is a non-acceptability, and we are forced to question because the experience is one of being uncomfortable in life. So we'll take a couple of questions and then that'll be it. Hi, Thomas.
Hi again, Roger.
Hello.
Hi. So I wanted to ask about states of anxiety, and I guess worry and anxiety. There's a sense that when they arise, that sometimes my wisdom mind will come in and cut the states off. You know, sometimes I'll put a full stop. I'll say full stop, and they'll dissipate. But other times, or more often than not, there's a kind of escalating that happens.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, even now I'm feeling a bit anxious. So what is it that causes states of anxiety to escalate and to stick around for longer than they need to?
Source. The notion of them sticking around longer than they need to is it's an overlay on what is. It's Thomas's assessment, right? From the angle that I'm describing today is that source creates life exactly as it is created. And so from a quiet point of view, there is no question of this how do we get rid of anxiety? Anxiety has hung around longer than it needs to. From the perspective of witnessing, which is easier said than done, I'm not suggesting that we can witness. Witnessing happens when it is part of Source's creation. And witnessing doesn't happen when it's not destined to happen. It doesn't happen. And so really, the underlying concept, even though we talk about this is about happiness for the human being and happiness is about the end of suffering, that's just a description. It's not saying I'm telling the doer how they can get rid of suffering, which is how we might hear it. We might say it's about the end of suffering, so I now have to do the end of suffering. It may not be someone's destiny for suffering to end today. It may not be destiny for it to end tomorrow. It may be destiny for there to be no suffering for a week and then for it to come back. And destiny is another word for the unfolding of the creation. So the creation, including your question, my answer, the feelings that arise in response to my answer, all of that is the creation, is destiny. It's not being done by you or me, but rather unfolding as part of Source, which is infinite creative potentiality, exploding into manifestation in this form.
If a feeling arises or a thought, it'll stick around for as long as it's destined to.
Sure, because it's fueled by the author, by Source, to maintain that. So a thought doesn't hang around unless it is fueled by Source to be there in each moment. So all of the content is essentially imagined. So you can look at Source as a master, and daily life, including all of our feelings and thinking and reactions and actions and outcomes, as the masterpiece. So life, whether you look at just your life or humanity as a whole, is the masterpiece.
Yeah. So I mean, we spoke recently, and you were going over the point that I'm not doing suffering, suffering just arises as a happening.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess that's still something that I'm getting to grips with.
Yeah, maybe we haven't got to grips with the fact that the masterpiece includes so many splashes of suffering in it and can still be a masterpiece, right? And if, however, our definition of a masterpiece expands from maybe being what we appreciate, which is obviously not suffering. Suffering is not something that can be appreciated, really, because it's inherently an uncomfortableness with oneself. It can be appreciated as part of the diversity. We can say, wow, suffering is a color on the palette. It might not be one I like or one that feels nice, but it is a color on the palette. So if our appreciation of a masterpiece expands beyond what I would like it to be, in the same way as we can appreciate a horror movie as a valid genre of movies, then when we look at life, it's a bit of everything. It's drama, it's action, it's horror, it's comedy, all rolled into one big masterpiece.
You say quite often that suffering is a valid experience, which was quite radical when I first heard that. But sometimes that thought will pop into my head, in a suffering state, that, well, this is a valid experience, and it kind of it takes the sting out of it. It can do.
Yeah, well, because when you look at the nature of resistance is essentially saying this is not valid. This should not be. And so as soon as, if there can be an appreciation of, this is why it's so important to describe the flow of life and circumstance as sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain, because what it does is it can disarm our thinking mind from resisting pain as invalid and craving pleasure as valid. And it can bring in an appreciation that says, the flow of life is sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. So that means, let me expect the unexpected, which means today, let me expect anything within the range of extreme pleasure to extreme pain. And in expecting the unexpected, which really means expecting anything within that range, whenever anything in that range arises, which really means you can't think of anything that is outside of the range of extreme pleasure to extreme pain, whenever anything arises, it's going to fit into that category, which is what you expect from life. And then you can wrap into that not only understanding that the flow of life is sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain, but that your attitude to the flow of life is sometimes resistance and sometimes acceptance. And that just like the pleasure and pain are valid expressions of the flow of life, suffering and peace of mind are just the interconnected opposites of one's attitude to the flow of life. And they are valid and determined not by the one suffering, but rather created by source as part of the present moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if we're engaging, if suffering's happening, we're forced to engage with it, aren't we? Based on our genes and up-to-date conditioning.
That is the suffering, yeah. So the involvement, and then the involvement in the involvement, if that happens, is all part of the creation. Nothing is outside of the masterpiece, and that means that nothing that is happening nothing is the doing of Thomas or Roger. It's all created by source, and what is created by source has the feel of it that it is form that it is Roger's doing or Thomas's doing, but in fact the ultimate source of whatever happens is source.
Yeah, and it's just occurred to me that this is, I mean, in the infinite potential of life, that this is an amazing thing that's happening right now, this conversation that we're having. Because how many people are having these types of conversations, you know? So, yeah.
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 And
Thank you.
even if you look at just life in general, you know, because even the fact that suffering exists, that life exists, just so forget about the content, but just the very fact that an appearance of life exists, that there is an awareness of, you know, so even the fact that suffering is felt means there is awareness of suffering. And then if there is an awareness of the awareness of suffering, that's even greater, because we get to realize that there is an awareness of the awareness of life. So the very fact that life exists is mind-boggling. It's like, what is this? Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome. So this question, who am I, that we often hear about, that who am I is really referring to this question, what is this? Which is that's a depiction of a realization that life is happening, that is undeniable, and that there is awareness of the undeniable happening, or there is an undeniable sense of existence, which really means the undeniable awareness of life. And the answer to who am I is not going to be found in the mind, in the thinking. It's not going to be something we can write down, but it is the direct appreciation of that which is aware of the life that is happening. And from a place of amazement at, like, a knowing I am, and I'm not talking about I, the person, am, but the essence, I am, that is undeniable. Life is, I am. What life is, who I am, the knowing that I don't know who or what I am, but I know that I am, is the answer to who am I. Okay, I think there's one more question. I'll try and answer it quickly. Hi, Abhimanyu.
Good evening.
Good evening to you.
Roger, my question to you is there a difference between being conscious and witnessing?
Well, it all comes down to terminology again, because, Ramesh would say, quite rightly so, it depends. So it depends in which context the word, which context someone is using the word conscious in. So Ramesh would say everyone is always conscious. The fact that you don't bump into a tree means you are conscious of the tree. The fact you don't, when we wake up in the morning, we are conscious. That's how we know the bed and the shower and the food and the body, and so there is always consciousness. Witnessing tends to be that makes sense. Some people say, they're using the word conscious in a different way, and they go, I'm a conscious, as in I'm a, how would we say it? Like I'm awake, as in I am now, for the first time, I am conscious. Now that's obviously using the word conscious differently, because you're not for the first time conscious. You've been conscious, according to Ramesh's definition of conscious, every moment since you were a child, a baby. You were conscious. So if someone is talking about for the first time I am conscious, they're now talking about some shift that has happened. And that might equate to witnessing, where there is a consciousness of our consciousness, or an awareness of the fact that we are conscious, an awareness of the fact that there is always consciousness when we wake up in the morning and are aware of the house. That's always been the case. It hasn't taken spirituality or spiritual teachings to make us aware of the table and the chairs and all of that. So we've always been aware, but we haven't been aware that we have always been aware. And so becoming aware of the fact that we are aware is what is sometimes referred to as the waking up, meaning there is a recognition of the awareness that has always been there. And a recognition really means awareness has landed on the fact that we have always been aware. So witnessing particularly refers to the silent watching from a perspective that is, generally speaking, felt to be outside of the body. And how does that happen? That shift happens when the working mind understands the concept that is delivered that says you are not the body. And so when it is playing around with you are not the body, what you are is awareness, and awareness is primal to body, is prior to body, is before the body, isn't coming from the body. Then what can happen is the body is seen as essentially an object and is not the thing that is aware. And then we can find ourselves just sitting, and even the notion that I am sitting falls away, because what we know ourselves as is the awareness that is aware of everything that is happening, including the body sitting, let's say. So the witnessing tends to refer to a shift in identity, a shift from knowing oneself as the body to knowing oneself as the awareness in which the daily living happens, including the arising of the body. And I guess it's pretty radical to keep hearing those descriptions, but they're the descriptions that tend to break the perspective of life and the perspective of knowing oneself as something limited that is the default position that gets put in place by the development in life. Or another way of saying it is, it's a way in which the creation changes. So the creation is created so that we know ourselves and know life from the position of the body. And then at some point the creation starts including in it prompts that say, you are not the body. You are the awareness in which all the objects, including the body, arise. And if it's destiny, in other words, if the creation creates a shift where there is a knowing of oneself as the container in which everything arises, then we can say, oh, that's a shift, and witnessing from that point on becomes something that previously was maybe just a notion where we wondered, am I witnessing or not? I'm not sure if I witness or if I don't witness. I'm not sure if witnessing has happened or not. And if we find ourselves watching, but not from the perspective of the body, rather watching in particular the body, watching the thoughts arise, watching the body move, and being that which is aware of the body moving, then that tends to be what is referred to by witnessing.
In my recent experience, I've felt that when I meditate with my eyes closed, and the way you've explained the concept, it works exactly like that. I can witness a lot of my thoughts coming and going, but the world around me is totally gone. And it's only until I open my eyes that the world comes back to life again. So it's how that's happened for me so far.
Yeah, so in the closed eye meditation, we often, so if you're witnessing the thoughts, that's very good, and there's no body present. There is just the emptiness, let's say, and the thoughts arise in that conscious awareness space, let's say. Now, check if there are sort of residual self-images of someone sitting in a room in a world, because that can persist in our meditation without us even realizing it, where an underlying assumption that I am Abhimanyu sitting in my house meditating and aware of the thoughts arising, that may persist, and if that persists, it's sort of interfering with, in a sense, knowing yourself in a more free from thought manner. So if that's fallen away, and your meditation with closed eyes is, then it would be pretty close, or pretty much pure witnessing, because there isn't even the notion I'm a body in a room sitting. Then it's just a matter of a transition happening where that happens with closed eyes to that essentially maintaining itself even when what we call opening eyes happens, but really it's just where content arises on that same space where there was no content arises, and hopefully there is a capacity to maintain the position of being the formless awareness that is maybe more achievable or more available when there is no content, no daily living content. Because as soon as the content comes in, we tend to, the awareness tends to identify with the particular body-mind form again, which is how it's always known itself. So if it stabilizes in the closed eye meditation, then maybe notice that all that has happened is that no content has been flooded with content. And it's the same witnessing presence that can be aware of the daily life content in the same way as was happening in the closed eye meditation. So I'm sure it will continue to develop as the days go on.
In the closed eye meditation, the body feels like as if it's getting lighter and floating, and there's no that physical density being felt. So maybe is that what you're saying?
Yeah, well, I mean, in the closed eye meditation, if attention and particularly the thinking is less reinforcing the notion that there is a body even, which, sometimes just the touch of what we imagine to be our leg on the chair is enough to, in a way, superimpose a sense of the body in the meditation. So if we question and say, oh, that sense, that sensation, which the thinking says is my leg touching the chair, if you bring attention to it, then you realize it doesn't confirm a leg of a chair or a leg of a body or anything. That's all me bringing the past in and projecting it onto this experience. So a real presence with what is means that you can't find a body unless certain sensations are labeled as proof of a body. So the more that essentially the more that we catch out how we bring the past into the present, the quicker the sense of a body will completely fall away. And then you won't say the sense of the body feels lighter. You'll actually say there is no sense of a body. You might have sensation, but it no longer means sensation of a body. They're just sensations arising in the vast space. So not sensations of a person or of a body, just sensations like thoughts arising.
Hoping to get there soon. Thank you so much, Roger.
You're welcome.